Number 3. Chen Long-Qi. On May 25, 2009, the police in Taiwan were called to a warehouse. 2 female escorts were found unconscious and they had been sexually assaulted. The women said that they were too drunk and didn't know who sexually assaulted them. The police found DNA on the undergarments of one of the women. They had it tested and discovered that it belonged to more than one person. The results of the test led to the arrest of Chen Long-Qi, who rented the warehouse space where the women were found. The test said that Chen could not be excluded as a match to the DNA left on the victim's undergarments. Along with Chen, 2 other men were arrested. One of the men shared the warehouse space where the women were found with Chen. The 2 men admitted to having sex with the women, but said it was consensual. Chen, on the other hand, adamantly denied being involved at all. No one saw him in the area at the time of the assaults. He even had an alibi for the time that the assaults happened. Chen was hanging out at the warehouse before the assaults, but he left before the women arrived to pick up his wife at work. His wife's time card verified she left at 4 a.m., which is before the women arrived at the warehouse. After picking up his wife, they went home. The prosecutor argued that since Chen's DNA could not be excluded, he must be guilty. The judge agreed and he was sentenced to 4 years in prison. Chen refused to turn himself in and he went into hiding. He had to sell his business and divorce his wife. He lived alone in a small apartment, rarely leaving it. After his conviction, Chen got in touch with the Taiwan Association for Innocence. They had the DNA retested, so it expanded the profile. The results of the retest was that Chen's DNA could be excluded. Chen was basically convicted because of a statistical anomaly. When there is a mixture of 2 people's DNA, it's not possible to know what DNA came from what person. It would be like mixing the pieces of 2 very similar jigsaw puzzles together and then trying to construct both puzzles without the completed pictures as guides. It's possible that the 2 puzzles will be constructed properly, or there could be many different combinations from the mixed pieces that result in slightly different pictures. When Chen's DNA was compared, it was matched to one of those alternative combinations. At his trial, the prosecutor didn't say that Chen's DNA was a match, he just said that his DNA could not be excluded as a match. However, on that basis, a lot of people's DNA couldn't be excluded. The odds that someone's DNA would match some combination of the mixed DNA was 1 in 741. Taiwan has a population of 23 million people, so the mixed DNA could have been matched to thousands of men. In March 2014, nearly 5 years to the day that he was convicted, Chen was officially exonerated. It was the first victory for the Taiwan Association for Innocence, and Chen now volunteers for the organization. Number 2. Josiah Sutton. On October 25, 1998, a woman was kidnapped at gunpoint from the parking lot of her apartment. She was driven around in a Ford Escalade, and she was sexually assaulted in one of the back rows. After a few hours, they dropped her off in a field. The woman was obviously traumatized by the attack, and she went directly to the police. The woman said that there were 2 men in the Escalade. She said that one of her attackers wore a hat with the bill turned to the side. The other one was wearing a skull cap. She said that they were both 5'7" and weighed 120 to 135 pounds. The police were able to pull DNA from her clothes. The Houston Crime Lab thought the DNA came from 2 people. Since she was kidnapped from the parking lot of her apartment building, the woman didn't feel comfortable returning home. She finally did after 5 days. As she was driving over to the apartment, she saw 3 young men walking down the street. One was wearing his hat sideways, and the other one was wearing a skull cap. She contacted the police, and the 2 young men wearing the hats were arrested. The young man who was wearing his hat sideways was 16-year-old Josiah Sutton. Sutton was much larger than both the men that the woman originally described. She described the man wearing the sideways baseball cap as 5'7" and 135 pounds. Sutton was 6 foot and weighed over 200 pounds. Sutton and his friend voluntarily gave their DNA to the police. The Houston Crime Lab concluded that the DNA matched Sutton but excluded his friend. Sutton was arrested and charged with sexual assault. In 1999, Sutton went to trial, and a DNA expert with the crime lab testified that Sutton was a perfect match for the DNA. The jury deliberated for just over an hour. Sutton was found guilty, and he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. In prison, Sutton read about DNA, and he contacted several groups that worked to free wrongly convicted people. No one wanted to help him because the DNA put him at the crime scene. Then in November 2003, KHOU-TV in Houston aired a shocking report on the Houston Crime Lab. A reporter with the station had sent out the lab records from 7 criminal cases to several outside experts. The experts saw problems with all 7 cases. One expert said that a junior high school report was more scientifically sound than the records from the Houston Crime Lab. Sutton's mother was watching the news when the report came on, and she started screaming because she was so happy. She knew her son was innocent, and she thought she could now prove it. She got in contact with the reporter and the producer who broke the story and told them about her son. They had the records from Sutton's case reviewed, and the expert found several glaring errors. Notably, there was DNA from only 1 person, not 2. Secondly, at his trial, the DNA experts said that Sutton's DNA was an exact match to the DNA taken from the victim's clothes. The problem was that this statement was very misleading. Sutton was an exact match to some of the markers, but not all of them, and those markers aren't exactly rare. 1 in every 16 black men have those markers in their DNA profile. At least one juror who found Sutton guilty said that had he known that, he would have never voted to convict. In May 2004, after serving 4.5 years in prison, Sutton was released. He was also given $118,000 in compensation. In 2008, the DNA from the sexual assault was matched to Donnie Lamont Young, and he was arrested. After the problems at the Houston Crime Lab were made public, it was shut down, and there was an official investigation. They found that the staff was undertrained or completely untrained, and contaminations were known to happen. The Houston Crime Lab reopened 3 years later, and problems continued to plague it as recently as spring 2017. Number 1. John Puckett. In the summer of 1972, 22-year-old Diana Sylvester moved from Boston to San Francisco for a nursing job. On the morning of December 23rd, she finished her night shift at 7 a.m. and she went to her apartment. At around 8 a.m., the landlady who lived below her heard a loud thud and then a man yelling and a woman screaming. The landlady went upstairs to see if everything was okay. A man at the top of the stairs yelled at her to go away because they were making love. The landlady decided to call the police, and they arrived minutes later. When they went into the apartment, they found Sylvester dead. She was naked and she had been stabbed twice in the chest. Her neck also had some small cuts. The medical examiner said that she was probably sexually assaulted while a knife was held to her throat. One thing the police noted was that there was no sign of a break-in or a forced entry. Nearly immediately, the police had a suspect. He was a street artist named Robert Baker, who had recently escaped from a mental institute. He was the prime suspect in a sexual assault that happened 2 weeks earlier, just 4 blocks from Sylvester's apartment. The woman and her friend both said that Baker was the attacker, but for some reason, he wasn't arrested. 4 days after Sylvester was killed, Baker followed a woman and a young girl as they walked home. He harassed them as they walked. They lived only a few doors down from Sylvester. The police searched Baker's van and they found a parking ticket that was spotted with blood. DNA testing wasn't available in 1972, but they had the blood tested for type. It was type O, which was Sylvester's blood type. However, type O is the most common type of blood, so the bloody parking ticket wasn't enough to tie Baker to the murderer. Fingerprints were found at Sylvester's apartment and they were compared to Baker's. They weren't a match, so he was never arrested. Baker died 4 years after the murder, in 1978. The case sat cold for nearly 3 decades. Then in 2004, the San Francisco Police Department started going through their cold cases looking for DNA evidence. If DNA was found, it was tested against a database of DNA taken from offenders. Male DNA was found in Sylvester's mouth and had been saved, so they had the DNA tested. There was only one person in the database that couldn't be excluded. That was a 72-year-old man named John Puckett. Puckett had been convicted in 1977 for 3 sexual assaults. He was released from prison in 1985. He had 1 misdemeanor battery charge in 1988, but after that, he seemed to live a quiet life. He got married and worked as a repairman until he retired. He denied committing the murder, but the district attorney had a pretty convincing case. Mainly, the chances that the DNA was coincidentally Puckett's was 1 in 1.1 million. The district attorney also pointed out that when Puckett committed his sexual assaults, he dressed like a police officer. The women let him into their homes, and then he sexually assaulted them while holding a knife to their neck. It was very similar to Diana Sylvester's crime scene. There were no signs of a break-in or forced entry, and Sylvester was sexually assaulted while a knife was held to her throat. Puckett was ultimately found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. Puckett's lawyers appealed, and his lawyer hired a DNA expert. The expert said that there was a problem with the match. Humans have 13 DNA markers, and the possibility that 2 unrelated people share the same 13 markers is 1 in a quadrillion. Every time you remove a marker, the odds get better that someone else could have the same DNA markers. That means every time you remove a marker from a DNA profile, the profile becomes less unique. To compare DNA from cold cases to the database, at least 7 markers need to be identified in a sample. The DNA that was saved from Diana Sylvester's murder had degraded over the years, and they could only identify 5.5 markers. To get to the necessary 7 markers, they used faint markers that weren't conclusive. Another problem was that the DNA was a mix of 2 people's DNA. Since the sample came from Diana Sylvester's mouth, it is safe to assume that the second DNA belonged to her. When the district attorney told the jury that the odds that it was just a coincidence that the DNA matched Puckett was 1 in 1.1 million, he was telling the truth, but it was misleading. The database that was searched had 3,380,000 profiles. If you divide 1.1 million by 338,000, it is about 3.25. That means the chances that someone in the database would have the same 5.5 markers was 1 in 3. In 2004, the state of California had a population of 35.5 million people. If the odds that someone else had the same 5.5 markers was 1 in 1.1 million, and it was among 35.5 million people, then 32 people could have the same 5.5 markers. If you were to expand that to the entire United States, then 266 people could have the same 5.5 markers. Worldwide, there could be 5,873 people who share the same 5.5 markers. The DNA from Diana Sylvester's crime scene just happened to match Puckett, and he just happened to be the right age, and he happened to live in San Francisco at the time, and he had convictions for rape. Unfortunately, John Puckett died before a verdict on his appeal was reached. The consensus among DNA experts is that John Puckett did not kill Diana Sylvester. Thank you so much for watching today's video. If you liked it, please subscribe for more videos just like it. Please don't forget to visit criminallylisted.com, where you can suggest cases and buy merchandise. Please also check out our Patreon page, where you can get access to an exclusive podcast. But that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.